Originalism is this idea that says the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time, and whatever they claim the Constitution meant hundreds of years ago, that meaning remains authoritative today. We've seen this used perhaps most egregiously in Dobbs, where the conservative justices looked at some selected points in history, said at these particular moments in time, there was not a recognized right to abortion, and therefore state governments have the authority to regulate abortion however they feel like. It's absurd to base women's rights on a time when women did not have legally recognized rights. It simply bakes in the biases of that time period. Very expansive array of rights are now threatened because of that originalist framework.
Welcome to episode 207 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In today's episode, I'll share commentary on the anniversary of the overturn of Roe and share an interview with Madiba K. Dennie, author of The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back. Thank you to everyone who rates and reviews this show and everyone who sends me lovely little emails and comments on social media. Shout out to Caliburnification, who tweeted last week's episode and wrote, "This is well worth a listen. It's the most extensive and truly informative podcast with experts on fascism who inform us on what we are heading straight into." Help us reach more listeners at a time when, I know you agree, refusing fascism is needed more than ever. After you listen to the show, be sure to share it with others. Click the share button in your app to send this episode to a friend or 10, or let some strangers know why you listen by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. It really makes a difference. So thanks for that. Thanks as well to all the patrons who help make this show possible. Join the community today over at patreon.com/refusefascism. I have a couple of things to say on this eve of the overturn of Roe. Tomorrow, June 24th, marks 2 years since the Supreme Court stripped away federal protection for abortion care. 2 years later, the hell of living in the world's biggest superpower after its highest court has reduced women to incubators is felt across the country. It is felt by the over 26 million women and girls of reproductive age who live in states where abortion access is heavily restricted and often totally inaccessible. And it is felt by half of humanity in this country who have become second-class citizens. There is simply no overstating the harrowing magnitude of a deepening generational tragedy. There are lots of ways we can talk about the impact of the Dobbs decision and the implications of 2 years without the fundamental right to abortion in the United States. We can talk about it in numbers. 14, the number of states that have complete bans. 7, the number of other states which have gestational limits lower than the standard set by Roe. Abortion is now totally or near totally banned in 21 states across the country. 161,000, the number of women forced last year to travel because of abortion bans or restrictions in their state of residence. Tens of thousands, the number of people forced to give birth against their will. We can talk about the individual horrors of those denied abortion care, the dizzying daily tragedies that continue to mount. In Ohio, a 10-year-old girl forced to cross state lines to access care after she was raped. In Texas, Amanda's wanted pregnancy went awry when her water broke at 18 weeks of pregnancy. She was denied abortion care to remove the non-viable fetus. Amanda went septic because of this. She required a 3-day stay in the ICU to save her life. Her future ability to have children is now compromised. In Oklahoma, Jackie was told to wait in a hospital parking lot until she was closer to death before doctors would treat her molar pregnancy with a DNC. In Mississippi, Ashley, a rape survivor, age 13, was forced to carry to term. Multiply the stories again and again. Stories including, but not limited to, those brought to the brink of death from sepsis or bleeding out or before they could get care for miscarriages or high-risk or non-viable pregnancies. And then there are all the stories we don't hear. The stories of those who just don't want to be mothers or already are and do not want another child or don't want one now. Those whose ambitions reach beyond their womb every single day. Countless people who simply do not want to be pregnant, being denied necessary abortion care. Stories of young people who want to finish high school or go to college, moms who want balance instead of larger families, trans men and non-binary folks honoring their gender identity over an unplanned pregnancy, of anyone deciding that their life's possibilities matter more than a life that is yet to exist. We can talk about the questions we didn't think we would need to ask. Doctors wondering, how close to death does the state wish that I force my patient to get to before I give them care? Can I post this abortion information on TikTok? If I search for a clinic or if I search for abortion medication, will they be able to find me? How do I help my daughter get an abortion when it's banned in my state? Can I ask my friends or family to help, or will that make them targets of a vindictive state power? Can I find maternal care near me, or did all the OBGYNs leave and maternity wards close? Will the Supreme Court decide today to let us die in emergency rooms instead of letting doctors provide abortions in states where it is banned? We can also talk, and should also talk, about what it means for women and girls everywhere in the United States to be reduced to baby machines at the hands of the state, and the enslaving logic this is enshrined in all of the South and red states across the country. On top of all of this, as harrowing as the past 2 years have been, it is clear that this is only the beginning of the hell they hope to rain down on women, girls, and LGBTQ people. There are no safe zones in their quest for theocratic domination. Our world has changed. We changed. Some of us don't think we have, but we've changed in what we allow, what we suppress, what we ignore, what lies we will choose to believe, how we have accommodated a Christian fascist movement that has only accelerated their theocratic aims, telling you no, screaming at you that they are coming for it all, coming for us all. And I wonder where the line is. I have no hopium to dispense, but I am not hopeless. It rests with you. It rests in us. It rests in our rage, in our refusal to accept anything less than being recognized as full human beings, with us realizing our power is the same as it ever was, unbounded by those who preach the politics of the possible, which is the politics of immiseration. We exercise that power when we relentlessly insist on our humanity, demand our freedom and our future. May we take this anniversary to commit to not another moment of submission, to being their living nightmare for as long as our dear ones are forced to live in their living hell. We have to stand up and fight this assault and question what kind of fucked up system not only allows this nightmare, but has patriarchy woven into its very fabric. What Sarah Taylor said outside the Supreme Court when the decision came down remains true.
Get to this place? For decades, the Democratic Party sought common ground with these religious fascists. For decades, they said abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, as if there is something wrong or shameful about women controlling their own bodies, their own lives, their own reproduction. Abortion should not be rare. It should be available on demand without apology. And it should be well done. It should be legal. It should be available on demand. Because without the right to abortion, women cannot be free. Forcing women to have children against their will is a form of enslavement. That is something something the Democratic Party will not say, will not fight for. Biden won't even say the word abortion. So let's be clear. Let's be clear. If we want to reverse this fascist, illegitimate decision, it is not going to come by waiting on Congress. It is not going to come by voting in November. It is not going to come by pleading with these Democrats. It is going to come if we rise up and we dare to take history into our hands.
That's right. Yes.
Let's be real. There has never been a fundamental advance won for the masses of people through the election booth. Even the right to vote was not won by voting. It was won by people doing freedom rides. It was won by people standing up and going to jail. It was won by suffragettes going on hunger strike while locked up incarcerated. If even the right to abortion was not won by waiting for the elections or waiting for the courts, women rose up. Women fought back. How was marriage equality won? How was marriage equality won? How were LGBTQ rights won? By rising up, by filling the streets. If we want, and we must restore legal abortion across this country, it is going to take struggle. It is going to take sacrifice. It is going to take putting it on the line. Not just waiting, not just one day. It is going to take people disrupting business as usual. It is going to take people engaging in non-violent direct action, civil disobedience, and shutting this country down. We must not allow them to have business as usual. Well, that includes the enslavement of women. We need to flood these streets across the country and demand from the federal government the restoration of legal abortion on demand across this country. Can I get some noise for that? So, I want to say it again, and I want you to repeat this because I want you to feel it. We have power too.
We have power too.
We have power too.
We have power too.
In these streets.
In these streets.
Rising up.
Rising up.
For abortion rights.
For abortion rights.
Not backing down.
Not backing down.
Abortion on demand.
Abortion on demand.
Across this land.
Across this land.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
This decision must not stand.
This decision must not stand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
This decision must not stand.
This decision must not stand.
Women's lives are in our hands.
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 Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
Illegitimate.
Illegitimate.
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court.
Illegitimate.
Illegitimate.
This decision.
This decision.
This decision.
This decision.
Illegitimate.
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 Forced motherhood.
Forced motherhood.
Forced motherhood.
Forced motherhood.
Illegitimate.
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 This decision must not stand.
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 Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
We face a horrendous defeat, but we need not be, must not be defeated. Together, let's affirm the urgent demand, legal abortion on demand and without apology, nationwide and everywhere.
This decision must not stand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
This decision must not stand.
This decision must not stand.
Legal abortion on demand.
Legal abortion on demand.
As we warned, the Christian fascist movement took their victory, overturning abortion rights, as a springboard for accelerating their juggernaut, stripping abortion rights, going after the abortion pill, IVF, birth control, and no-fault divorce, attacking LGBTQ rights, with genocidal attacks on trans youth and gender-affirming care bans sweeping the nation. Josh Hawley, Republican senator from Missouri, had this to say at the Faith and Freedom Conference.
What divides America is the left's attempt to destroy religion. That's what divides America. What is dividing America is their attempt to erase our heritage, to erase the foundation that this country has in, yes, the Bible. This is the greatest country in the history of the world because we are a country founded on the principles of the Bible. That is the truth. And most Americans know it. They know it to be true. They know it to be true. Who's dividing America is the radical left. And that's why I say to you, we don't need less Christian influence in our society. We don't need less Christian witness in our society. We need more in every part of government, in every part of society. You know what we ought to do? We ought to take the pride flag out of schools and put the Bible back in. You know what? You know what? We ought to take the trans flag down from all of our federal buildings, and over every federal building in America write the words, "In God we trust." In God we trust. Amen.
This movement is dangerous, determined, and deadly, and is not waiting for November. They are disregarding the rule of law, the validity of elections, and the peaceful transition of power. They need to be taken seriously and opposed accordingly. For one clear example of their theocratic zeal, this week in Louisiana, Governor Jeff Landry signed into law a bill that mandates the display of the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms from kindergarten to state-funded universities. Yes, it's clearly unconstitutional, and yes, this has already been ruled as a violation of the Establishment Clause by the Supreme Court in the 1980s. But as Sarah Posner, an investigative journalist, author, and columnist who has covered the Christian right and right-wing extremism for 20 years, put it in her newsletter, quote, "The 10 Commandments mandate is a means of gaining acceptance for their core belief that America should be governed according to, quote-unquote, biblical law." Going on to say, quote, "The bill's proponents do not merely want the 10 Commandments to be displayed. They want their interpretation of them and the Bible to be understood as the only legitimate foundation of all American law. They are now confident their view that Christianity is under threat is shared at the highest echelons of American government, including by House Speaker Mike Johnson and a majority of Supreme Court justices. They know this, not just because Trump stacked the court with right-wing ideologues. They know it because the court has said so," end quote. We will have more to say on the theocratic threat and the courts in upcoming episodes, but recommend listening to our interview with the filmmaker of Bad Faith, Steve Ulaki, which we uploaded June 9th. It's episode 205, and episode 197, which we uploaded April 14th, featuring an interview with Merle Hoffman, author of Choices, a Post-Roe Rights Manifesto. Go back and scroll through. You'll find many more. This week, in the interview, we're talking about the Supreme Court and originalism, and there are two rulings from this week that need highlighting. First, United States v. Rahimi. Shockingly, this wasn't the worst ruling. It ends up as a good ruling, but it draws attention to New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen from 2022, a horrific decision that was a model of originalism. The consequences of that decision were so blatant and horrific that in Rahimi, they were forced to dial it back. The court ruled 8-1 that a federal law prohibiting people subject to domestic violence orders from possessing guns does not, in fact, violate the Second Amendment. This decision is likely to save many women and children's lives. Clarence Thomas was the lone dissenter. It effectively narrows the Bruen Doctrine in order to get guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. Bruen, which this same court decided just 2 years ago, brought the legality of basically every gun regulation into question. In Bruen, Clarence Thomas wrote for the 6-justice fascist supermajority, declaring that laws regulating guns are unconstitutional unless they are, quote, consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, end quote. Madiba excavates this more in the interview, that originalism is essentially fan fiction. Moira Donegan, writing for The Guardian, put it this way, quote, the court's appeal to history has always been selective and pretextual, deployed with little consistency, intellectual honesty, or concern for historical accuracy in order to achieve the preferred policy outcomes of Republican justices, end quote. She went on to say, quote, but it has never been a workable or acceptable reality that originalism and its selective, often fact-free fantasies of the past has been called upon to determine policy outcomes in the present. The lives of women who have survived domestic abuse should never have depended on what 9 unaccountable jurists imagine the founding era to have been like, end quote. The second decision is Department of State v. Munoz. In a 6-3 vote this past Friday, the fascist-stacked, largely Trump-curated Supreme Court majority upheld the Biden administration's disgusting challenge to a lower court ruling. That lower court ruled that the State Department must give an explanation when denying a visa to the spouse of a U.S. citizen. For the 6-3 majority, Barrett held that U.S. citizens have no constitutional liberty interest in their non-citizen spouses being admitted to the country. This decision drastically erodes marriage rights for mixed status couples. For more on this, see reporting from Mike Ludwig for Truthout, linked in the show notes. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, cited Obergefell v. Hodges, the landmark 2015 ruling legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. She calls out the undermining of rights guaranteed in Obergefell and exposes the majority repeating what she considers, quote-unquote, the same fatal error it made in Dobbs. Writing, quote, the burden will fall most heavily on same-sex couples and others who lack the ability for legal or financial reasons to make a home in the non-citizen spouse's country of origin, end quote. With that, here is my interview with Madiba K. Dennie.
It is that time of year where every Thursday you wake up, maybe it's just me, but I wake up with explosive diarrhea because of the new special hell that this lawless Christo-fascist majority, Trump-stacked Supreme Court will potentially rain down. This time, there isn't just one day dedicated for bad decisions, but this week, we get to experience that feeling twice. And this year, this special feeling might even go all the way into July. And when the justices are ripping away fundamental rights, they often do so in the name of originalism. But what the hell is that? And why does that whole framework cause so much harm, and do we need to move away from it? To get into this, I am so pleased to welcome back onto the show Madiba K. Dennie, author of The Originalism Trap, which was released earlier this month. Madiba is the deputy editor and senior contributor at the critical legal commentary website, Balls and Strikes, which we frequently reference and use on this show. She is the co-editor of the Democracy Committee of the New Jersey Reparations Council, previously a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. You've likely read her legal and political commentary places like The Atlantic, The Washington Post, or have seen her interviewed on MSNBC or other media outlets. This is Madiba K. Dennie's first book, The Originalism Trap, and we are so excited to talk with her about it. So welcome, Madiba. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me back.
I guess let's start with the most important. What the heck is originalism?
So originalism is this idea promoted by the conservative legal movement that says the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time. There is a single, discoverable, historical meaning, and whatever they claim the Constitution meant to the public hundreds of years ago, when its provisions were first ratified, that meaning remains authoritative today. So however we are interpreting the Constitution now has to be how it was interpreted then.
So what are the implications of that?
The implications can be pretty grave. Just earlier today, at the time of recording, the court decided U.S. v. Rahimi and had to walk back a bit the really sweeping originalist decision it made a couple years ago in the New York NRA versus Bruin case. In Rahimi, the Fifth Circuit basically said, laws that disarm people who have domestic violence protective orders against them are unconstitutional because the country does not have a history of disarming domestic violence offenders. And it's like, well, of course the country doesn't, because the country only started taking violence against women seriously as a legal issue for like the past few decades. And I think that's a really glaring example of how basing our constitutional interpretation on a single historical moment in time really disempowers people who have historically had to fight for their rights because it stacks everything against them. Now, today in the Supreme Court's decision on Rahimi, they had to try walk that back a bit because they realized just how awful the consequences would be. And most of them were not willing to stick with that. I say most because it was an 8-1 decision. Clarence Thomas was like, no, I said what I said in Bruin, and I'm perfectly happy living with these consequences, even though other people may not live because of the consequences. All of the other conservative justices were really hemming and hawing, trying to find a way to reconcile the originalist demands with their unwillingness to say it's unconstitutional to disarm domestic violence offenders.
Where did this notion of originalism come from, and how did it become so ubiquitous and so revered?
I think there's a misconception today that originalism just sort of is the way we do things and has always been the way we do things. But in fact, history and tradition and our ideas about what the original public meaning of a constitutional provision may have been, those have been a factor. But it's only in recent decades that original public meaning idea has become the sole factor. And this is something that really developed in the backlash to the civil rights movement. Groups who were really opposed to desegregation and opposed to progress made by women's liberation movements and labor movements. In order to roll back the rights that those groups had won, they were looking for another constitutional avenue. The way they decided was that this gets away from how the Constitution was originally understood, and therefore it's illegitimate and invalid. But before the 60s, in response to Brown v. Board, we didn't really have that many folks saying this is the only way you can make decisions. It could be a consideration, but not the determinative factor above all else, which is very much how Clarence Thomas, you see, in the Bruin decision and in his dissent in Rahimi, he's talking about history and tradition to the exclusion of any other consideration. This was a fringe idea for a long time. I think one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society, he said that back when he was coming up in law school and when he was new in legal academia world, he said you could have fit all the originalists comfortably around the kitchen table. There just weren't that many of them. It wasn't really a thing yet. But the conservative movement very much dedicated itself to it becoming a thing, whether it's through the Federalist Society and sort of cultivating these networks of young originalists to be put into positions of power. Also, there was a significant role played by Ronald Reagan's Justice Department. During his presidency, Edwin Meese III led the DOJ, and it basically functioned as like an originalist think tank, working to develop these ideas and making originalism like the method of interpretation that the government would use in all of its arguments. These things together, the sort of professionalization of these reactionary grievance politics, coupled with the formation of these like support networks, really allowed the conservative legal movement to get originalism recognized as something legitimate instead of something on the fringes, and putting them in places of power to execute that vision.
I have been thinking about how, for our listeners, this notion of originalism becomes less abstract, how we see it shaping our everyday lives. And we'll get into that more, I'm sure, through examples that you've been writing about, thinking about in terms of recent court decisions. But I'm also thinking about the parallels that this court in particular, but the originalism movement overall has with what I call fascist framework of Make America Great Again. And the reinforcement, if you will, of this vengeful, revanchist vision. And I wanted to just open it up for you to comment on any parallels that you see and how they work together.
I think there definitely is a relationship between originalism and between the growing fascist movement in the country. You mentioned Make America Great Again. I think by its own terms, originalism is essentially make the Constitution great again, in that they're saying we need to get back to our imagined vision of this better past time when there were fewer rights for people not like us. And that was actually the correct understanding. And we need to be setting things back in time. That's the same kind of thing that Trump is saying at his rallies. They just dressed it up a bit with some legalese. I think there's definitely a connection there. I think there's also a relationship in that originalism is pretty anti-democratic by nature, in that it says that all of us alive today basically don't actually have a say over what the Constitution means. It really limits whose opinion matters, and that is only the opinions of the justices on the Supreme Court, and even then, only if they are abiding by what they claim long dead founding era people once thought. It takes away our power, our responsibility for self-governance. I think it conflicts with democracy in that way, which then sort of supports the authoritarian movement that is going on now.
One thing that you wrote that just was so clear to me, and I felt like, yes, this is it. Thank you for giving me words to my thought, was where you wrote that it, being originalism, gives the judiciary extraordinary power to put historically marginalized people back in their place and buttress the country's longstanding stratification of power and wealth. That, to me, is so much in line with the goals of the Trumpist movement. You think about a legal movement that is looking at the original Constitution through the lens of a mechanism that objectively ratified slavery, didn't consider Black people full human beings, didn't give women any rights, justified the theft of land and the genocide of Native peoples, and that being what originalism is. And if you look at that in terms of law and what this fascist movement wants to do in terms of things like stripping away the rights of women and LGBTQ people, or the rights of immigrants, or the rights of any group, they can use, oh, well, back then we didn't do that, so we shouldn't do it now. Think about just how heinous that is. A lot of liberal people with wonderful sense of justice, but also a lot of illusions, I think, and a lot of rose-colored glasses about the Constitution as a document, who only see it through the lens of expanding the rights of people. There's that tension there. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about how do you see it evolving?
I would argue that our constitutional understanding should evolve. I don't think that makes it any less legitimate than this idea of it must only be based in history. That's what we see a lot of the conservative justices insisting. They'll say, if we're not basing our interpretation on history, then it gives you license to do whatever you want. That's not true at all. I think that we have seen plenty of examples to the contrary. And also, even when you are ostensibly basing things on history, you're still deciding which times in history. How are you defining the thing you're looking for in history? Whose history matters? Because as you listed off, lots of horrible things in American history. And also there's consistently been lots of resistance to those horrible things as well. But it's never that history that matters to the conservative justices. I would argue that we should have evolving constitutional interpretation, and we should use as our guidepost in that evolution the principles of the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments being those that were enacted after the Civil War to address the status of newly freed Black people and to actually build, for the first time under the Constitution, a functioning multiracial democracy. I think that this should reframe and recontextualize our entire understanding of the Constitution. I call this inclusive constitutionalism.
If we contrast that vision with how is originalism serving the court now? How is that shaping some of the most grotesque stripping of constitutional rights away? And what might that look like if that wasn't the framework?
We've seen this used perhaps most egregiously in Dobbs, where the conservative justices looked at some selected points in history, said at these particular moments in time, there was not a recognized right to abortion, and therefore state governments have the authority to regulate abortion however they feel like, regardless of other points in history, regardless of what actually makes sense for women to be able to function as equals in society, regardless of bodily autonomy. And I think that this is outrageous and really representative of the kind of originalist logic and consequences. If I say a group of people didn't have rights then they can't have rights now. And I think that abortion is only the beginning. We have seen breadcrumbs already showing that how this could be used to take away birth control access, to take away same-sex marriage rights. Very expansive array of rights are now threatened because of that originalist framework.
When we talk about the overturning of Roe, that anniversary is coming up. When we upload, it will be on the eve of the second anniversary of the Dobbs decision. In the book, you talk about, you don't use these words, but the Supreme Court's love affair with originalism poses special risks to women. And that's exemplified in the Dobbs decision. And you alluded to just now, like the way that it isn't limited just to that one case or just to abortion. And I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to speak to regarding that special danger posed by an interpretation that looks at the rights of women from the founding and not the status of women as full human beings.
It's absurd to base women's rights on a time when women did not have legally recognized rights. And I think originalism portrays this as something neutral and objective, but it is a choice to make that your standard. And it simply bakes in the biases of that time period. I realize I've spoken a bit about what originalism means for individual rights, but it also can go even broader than that. I think we've seen some debate around that among the conservative justices in ways that could affect the economy even in sweeping ways, in that primarily Sam Alito, but he wasn't the only one, wanted to shut down the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, basically saying, I don't see historical evidence of agencies being funded in this way before. So that means that the way the CFPB is funded now is unconstitutional. So its rulings and the regulations it makes are invalid. We're seeing an effort to employ originalism in a way that would basically free those who have always had power, your wealthy people, like your corporations, to exert that power any way they see fit, preventing the Constitution from being able to actually protect people. It really is a matter of values, and they're choosing what interests matter to them when they choose their interpretive method. But they're pretending that it's all neutral and objective. This is the one legitimate way to do things.
It's the logic. Have your objectives, have your aim, and then come up with the legal reasoning to justify them. The insanity of upholding mechanisms of mass murder through bump stocks or AR-15s or all the different things that they've upheld when clearly those things were not around when that was written, and that being somehow okay, but
they pick and choose when it matters to them.
The cherry picking of how literal they want to be or how originalist they want to be.
The bump stocks decision was actually surprising to me in that I remember listening to the oral argument and thinking that particular argument being advanced, saying that, the relevant question is about a single function of the trigger. And so you need to think about the way the mechanics of a trigger works, like inside the gun. I was listening to this oral argument and I was thinking, well, obviously that's absurd. I won't be surprised if they find a way to say the bump stock regulation is invalid, but surely they'll pick a reason other than that. And so imagine my surprise when I read the opinion and I was like, oh no, that's actually the one they went with. Because I just thought it was so ridiculous to say we need to interpret the law from the perspective of the gun. And it's based on our torture definitions of how inside of a gun works. And Clarence Thomas supported this with a GIF from some gun advocacy group as if this is somehow a reputable source. And it's really outrageous and sort of really exposes how their ideas about objectivity and neutrality and like they're reasonably doing law while anyone who deviates from what they say is just doing policy or running rogue. It really makes clear like, well, that's all nonsense.
Are there cases in addition to the bump stock case that you feel expose some of the hypocrisy of this originalism claim? I was thinking today, I haven't had time to really sit with it. For instance, the case having to do with the rights of people who are married to a citizen.
I know the one you're referring to. I haven't gotten to read it yet because the court, they have so many opinions left so that they are now issuing like 3-4 decisions a day when they do drop decisions. So I haven't gotten to look at all of the ones that came out this morning yet. But that is definitely concerning. And from the little bit I've gleaned from it so far, I don't want to speak necessarily too authoritatively since I haven't done a close read of it yet, but it did seem like they were using a history and tradition style reasoning to say that there is not a fundamental like liberty interest in having your spouse in the same country as you. And I think this basically treats all unenumerated rights such as abortion, like we saw in Dobbs, as inherently suspect. And it makes it an uphill battle for anyone trying to recognize a right or protect their rights if they weren't already clearly recognized rights for rich white guys in the 1700s. This is the standard that the court has created, and will make life challenging for much of the country.
You were talking about the amount of cases that like haven't even come out yet. One of them being Trump's immunity claim. And here in this upside down, we're 3.5 years after Trump's coup attempt, he is running competitively, aided and abetted by a Supreme Court that uses originalism where it serves them, not using it, perhaps, in the case of whether Trump should stay on the ballot or not, based on what
there suddenly originalism no longer mattered.
Trump is staying on the ballot, and the immunity case, presidents can do crimes, still has no ruling. I just wanted to see if there are any comments or if there's any key points you think people need to understand, but really aren't grasping about the significance of a Supreme Court basically driving Trump's getaway car, or at least filling it with enough gas to get free.
I think that's a great way to put it. Like, they are very much an accomplice in Trump's activities. They are furthering the coup. The coup is continuing. It has just moved from the Capitol to the Supreme Court. That's all. But the coup is very much still ongoing because the conservative justices are trying to ensure that Trump does not face even the possibility of accountability for his actions. Like, we're not even talking about there was a ruling that they're trying to negate. Let's talk about the possibility of even having the trial that we're still waiting on all these years later. And I think it's a brazen partisan move. The court is fully capable of deciding things quickly when they want to decide things quickly. I think it was a case about Nixon, one of the similarly politically contentious cases, was decided in 21 days? We've seen cases be decided rapidly, and we know that a majority of the country, polling has showed, want the decision before the election actually occurs. They would like to know whether or not the president is found guilty for trying to overthrow the government. And for the Supreme Court to just drag that out on and on and on, they're intentionally delaying that, intentionally trying to help Trump avoid any accountability, any responsibility. It should really color people's perspective of how legitimate they think the court is at all. Saying like, this is not an institution that's a neutral arbiter of the law. They are clearly all aboard the Trump train, and they are acting accordingly.
I'm wondering what you think the implications of this might be as we approach the fall. People were, I think, relieved in 2020 by decisions that the court made or didn't make in terms of intervening on Trump's behalf. And do you feel that things have changed since then in terms of their willingness to intervene on Trump's behalf?
Well, I think with the continuing delay on the decision, it's sort of like a non-intervention intervention. They get to literally just sit on their hands and not do anything, but as a result, they are helping Trump. It's an interesting frame thinking about like them directly intervening because like they have a way to avoid getting involved in a way that helps them achieve partisan goals.
I definitely think that that is what they're doing right now. I'll be interested to see when you have Johnson so brazenly coming out and saying, yeah, there are people. We'll just ask them.
It's legitimately funny because it was the day after Chief Justice John Roberts was shutting down the request from Senators Durbin and Senator Whitehouse. Like, thank you for inviting me to talk to you all. I'm not going to do that because I think it would look too partisan. And then the very next day, you have Representative Johnson like, let me call up my boys at the Supreme Court and see what they can do about this.
Exactly. There's this question that I have that is connected to another question. And basically it's, how do they get away with this? And how does anyone take this seriously? Their defining feature of originalism, or one of its defining features, is its total opportunism. They can discard it whenever it doesn't suit their needs. As weighty as originalism sounds, the concept is intellectually empty. These justices aren't historians. They often pride themselves on ignorance of the social sciences. How do they keep getting away with it? And how does anyone take this seriously?
If you don't think about it too long, you might take it seriously. You might just say, oh yeah, and interpret the Constitution the way folks said it should be. Okay, sure, that makes sense. Without thinking, actually, how have circumstances evolved? How should these terms actually apply today? Not necessarily how they applied then. Who all got to be part of that decision-making process then, who we maybe didn't care about then, and what we do care about now. If you don't think about it too long, there are ways that you can say, oh yeah, that sounds fine, and sort of brush it off. I think that conservatives have also benefited from basically faking it till you make it, like acting as if it were reasonable, talking about it in public as if it were reasonable, and insisting that this is the best way to do things. Even today, in the Rahimi opinion, many of the conservative justices wrote solo concurrences where they all had slightly different approaches, but they were all trying to say originalism is still the right metric, and we are still good originalists. It's still the one right way to make decisions, because otherwise it's just individual judges' personal policy dispositions. Meanwhile, we have seen the justices choosing whatever moment in history supports their personal policy dispositions, even when there are other moments in history that contradict that. We've seen how originalism is just a guise for doing precisely that, but they insist in the most holier-than-thou fashion that they are the ones who are doing true law by following originalism, and anyone else, they're the disingenuous ones, not us. They're really good at projection.
Moving from the world that they seek to create and the document which they use to justify that creation, I wanted to, as we close out the conversation, move to what we can do and what role we play. And even though I see personally, just me as an individual, personally think that the Constitution is an exploitator's vision of freedom, the freedom to dominate. I think that that's what we've seen throughout history. I wanted to ask you, in this moment where we have one of the two major political parties, the Republican Party, preparing for the outright seizure of state power and the open and arbitrary elimination of constitutionally guaranteed rights to the extent they exist, what recourse do people have when faced with a Supreme Court that's lawless, that is telling you that they are the law, and that really is an accomplice to this fascist movement? What is it that we can do. You oftentimes hear, well, there's nothing you can do. They can't be this. They can't be that. What can we do?
I want to tell you my favorite story of what we can do, because I think we have seen throughout history that there is always something we can do. And so I like to point out to people that the text of the Constitution didn't actually change in between the court saying there was no legal problem with jailing someone for riding in a train car while Black, and the court saying actually segregated schools are unconstitutional. What changed in that time was how people demanded the Constitution be read. The public and the court as well, I think they sometimes forget that the court's authority is sort of based on its reputation. It doesn't actually have any tools of its own to enforce its decisions. It depends on public consent. So people can stop consenting. People can choose to say, actually, I don't think the court is the sole arbiter of constitutionality, and I think the court is getting the Constitution wrong. They can articulate, whether in the streets in protest or in their state legislatures or on their state courts, wherever they get a foothold in, they can assert a different understanding of the Constitution. And they should do so. They should take their power back from the court to say, you're not the only one who has a say. Like, I do actually have a say, and my say is different than yours.
I want to thank you so much, Madiba, for coming on, for sharing your book, The Originalism Trap, with the world, and for sharing your expertise and insight with us. It is always a treat to speak with you, and we learn so much from your work. I want to let folks know that the link to purchase The Originalism Trap is in the show notes. Madiba, is there any other things that you're working on that you want people to know? Or if after they read your book, they want to read even more from you, where can they find you and how can they connect to you and your work?
If you're interested in reading even more after you go out and read the book, you can always find my new writing at Balls and Strikes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for more on the courts, Constitution, the threats of theocracy, and stopping fascism. We have some great interviews lined up for the summer and don't want you to miss any. So be sure to subscribe, follow wherever you listen to your podcast. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. I know we promised it for a couple weeks, but we are going to be posting really soon some t-shirts. So keep staying tuned for that. And thanks to those who've sent their thoughts on colors, types, designs, etc. Keep sending them our way. Patreons, there is a post, I think it's pinned, asking for your input. So let us know. Got thoughts or questions off this episode? We want to hear them. Ideas for topics or guests? Yes, please send them to us. Have a skill you think could help? We want to know all about it. Reach us on the socials at Refuse Fascism, at just about all the places, and on the YouTubes, reply with a comment. Find us at Refuse_Fascism, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if YouTube is your thing. Leave us a voicemail. See the show notes for the button. And if you want to reach me personally, you can find me at Twitter at Sam B. Goldman. You can drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org or on the TikToks at Sam Goldman RF. You want to help this show reach more people when it's needed most? Awesome. As people rightly agonize over the fascist threat, help publicize the show via podcast ads and social media by becoming a patron for as little as $2 a month. Do it at patreon.com/refusefascism. Whether you can give $2 or $25 a month, it seriously all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent, all-volunteer weekly podcast. And if you aren't in a position to give monthly but want to support the show, we totally get it and appreciate you. Visit refusefascism.org and hit the donate button, or see the show notes for other methods to give a one-time donation. Thank you for your support. And if you can't give now, or you did already, you're already a patron, share the show with others. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It matters and helps this understanding get to more people and helps build and strengthen this community. Thanks to Mark Tinkelman, Richie Marini, and Lena Thorne for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.